Algebra 2 Honors Cram, Skills Practice, Flashcard 4, Rewrite Expression Using I, Skill Practice 2.6-14. Now, the imaginary number I is such that I squared is equivalent to -1. And because no real numbers exist such that its square is equal to a negative number, the number I is not a part of the real number system. The values of I to the n, such as I to the first or I to the second, and so on, repeat every 4 powers of I. Therefore, we already have that I to the first is the square root of -1. I squared is -1. Therefore, I to the third would be I squared times I, or -1 times radical -1. And I to the fourth is simply, you could say I squared times I squared, or I to the third times I to the first, which would give you a negative square root of -1 times the square root of -1, which is the same thing as saying 1 when you evaluate the entire expression. Okay, so these are just a few baseline things to keep in mind as you solve problems that contain the imaginary expression I. Okay, all right, let's get into the problem. Okay, so what we're doing is we're rewriting expressions with negative roots using I. The expression that we're going to simplify today in terms of I is the square root of -75 plus the square root of 80 over 10, okay? And you should understand that expressions with negative roots, they can be rewritten. For any positive real number n, the principal square root of a negative number, negative n, is defined by the square root of -n. In this case, -n is -75, is equivalent to I times radical n, okay? And this portion can take many forms. So let's start simplifying. First, in order to simplify, we're going to factor. So we extract our -1 because we're going to later simplify in terms of I, times 25 times 3. So we further factored 75 because it has a perfect square here, so we can, kind of factor that out. And we also broke down 80 in terms of its perfect square and 5, okay? So further simplification will yield 5i. Again, we get the 5 by taking the square root of 25, a perfect square, and I is equivalent to the square root of -1 times radical 3. 3 is not a perfect square, therefore it'll yield like a decimal or something, so we can just leave it as is. Plus 4. 4 comes from the perfect square, or the square root of 16, times 5. Again, 5 is not a perfect square, so we're going to leave this as is. And this is all over 10, okay? So we don't really need to do anything else, and this expression is rewritten in terms of I. So this is our final answer. All right? Okay.